In the previous video, we learned that different levels at which living systems are organized can evolve. This happens whenever the three conditions of variation, heritability and competition are met. Through natural selection, units that are best at reproducing in the given competitive environment will proliferate. This does not at all mean that the evolutionary interest of these proliferating units aligns with that of other levels of organization. Sometimes these interests make them behave selfishly from the perspective of other levels of organization or other units at the same level. In this video we will see that the evolving units that make up living systems can behave selfishly. Even DNA can be selfish. Within the DNA of many organisms are genes that are exceptionally good at making copies of themselves. We can say that these have, in some sense, greater evolutionary success, but at the expense of other genes. Examples of this are genes that encode within themselves the capacity to cut and paste themselves around the genome. These are called transposable elements, or jumping genes. The cutting and pasting done by transposable elements can be very damaging to the rest of the genome, and, by extension, to the individual into which the genome manifests itself. Cutting and pasting can damage or inactivate genes that are affected by this process. If it happens many times, it can even affect entire chromosomes. The chromosome that was inherited from one of the parents could then become much longer than the chromosome inherited from the other parent. And because of this, the process that, during cell division, segregates them can fail. One of the daughter cells will then end up with too many chromosomes and the other with too few. Besides transposable elements, there are other examples where we can speak of selfish DNA. For instance, there are mechanisms whereby a gene can directly influence how often it shows up in the offspring. All things being equal, we would expect any gene to appear in about half of the offspring. However, there are ways in which genes can increase this proportion. We call this segregation distortion. This might be good for the gene, in the sense that this advances its evolutionary interests. But the mechanism by which this is done might be bad for the individual. For example, by causing the cell death of all reproductive cells that don't fully contain this selfish DNA sequence. This means that the investment in the production of reproductive cells is at least partially wasted. Another way in which this can be bad is if this mechanism appears on a sex chromosome. This will bias the sex ratio of the offspring, and you can imagine that it might not be good to have only sons or only daughters, if this means they will have a hard time finding mates. Higher levels of organization also pursue their own evolutionary interests in ways that threaten the rest of the living system. Over the lifespan of a long-lived multicellular organism, such as a human, cells and some tissues divide many times. In other words, they reproduce over many generations. Over the course of these generations, some of these cells might accumulate mutations in just the right genes, so they get better at reproducing than others, so much so that their cell line outcompetes other cell lines. Unchecked proliferation of mutated cell lines is cancer, which, as we know, is not at all good for the individual. The fact that cancer is basically an evolutionary problem is illustrated by recent findings that show that a very large proportion of cancers can be explained by the rate of cell turnover in the organ where the cancer arises. If the organ has high cell turnover, such as the colon, then there are more generations within which mutations can arise, and consequently a higher chance that cell proliferation, or cancer, evolves. This partly explains why colon cancer occurs more often than, for example, brain cancer, and this also explains why old people get more cancers than young people. We've talked about selfishness and projected this onto genes and cells as if they have a personality. Of course they don't, although the projection of personality might help to understand what we see in nature. Individuals have personality. So, actual selfishness occurs at the level of individuals. In fact, well understood enlightened self-interest rules the evolved behavior of all individuals basically all the time. In popular science books and documentaries of the 1950s and 1960s, a frequently heard turn of phrase was that animals did certain things for the good of the species. For For example, an animal was said to sacrifice itself to a predator so that others would live for the good of the species. This doesn't make any sense. The behavior that causes individuals to sacrifice themselves for others will obviously be filtered out of the gene pool. The only exception is if the others in the population are closely related, so that the genes for the supposedly altruistic behavior, in addition to all the other genes they share, live on and derive a benefit from the sacrifice. In fact, we can quantify quite precisely how many related individuals must benefit, and by how much, in order for me to sacrifice myself. My daughter carries half of my genes, the other half comes from my wife. Let's call the genes I share with my daughter one offspring unit. On average, I share about half of my genes with my brothers, a shared quarter for my mum and a shared quarter for my dad. My brother's children are each one offspring unit to their respective fathers, my brothers, and therefore they're half an offspring unit to me. If I would sacrifice myself for my children, I would therefore also sacrifice myself for twice as many nieces, because it will benefit the same amount of total shared genes. By saving twice as many nieces as children of my own, I still increase my so-called inclusive fitness to the same extent. Careful observation of the behavior of certain animals shows that this principle can be seen in nature. For example, this has been observed in a species of ground squirrel. If a ground squirrel notices a predator, it can emit an alarm call to warn the others in the population. However, this reveals the location of the squirrel. They still do it, and they don't even flee, instead choosing to continue to watch the predator while standing upright at great risk to themselves. This is because the other members of the colony are closely related, and so the individual that gives the alarm call can still increase its inclusive fitness even if it dies in the process. So, I am selfish when I take the last cookie on the plate, and we can spin this into a story where I have simply evolved this behavior in order to ensure sufficient caloric intake to survive at least long enough to reproduce. What if I instead give the cookie to my daughter? Is that altruism or evolved behavior to ensure sufficient caloric intake for any of the individuals that carry my genes? From the perspective of my genes, it doesn't matter whether they're inside me or inside another individual. I might be increasing my inclusive fitness by giving it to her. How about if I give the cookie to Menno, to whom I'm not related? Why would I ever do that? In the next video, we will look at evolved mechanisms that could make me do that. Mechanisms to suppress short-term self-interest.